Today, we're going to be covering the history of the Silver Surfer. This is to piggyback off of the release of the Fantastic Four movie. I just recently did a review of the movie, and the Silver Surfer is one of the most prominent characters in that story. I, of course, want to touch on this because the Silver Surfer is my favorite character in all of comic books, good, bad, what have you, Marvel, DC. If you are one of those people that fancy fables, fiction, film, tall tales, and high adventure, you are in the right place. Click like, click subscribe, even click the notifications. You'll get keyed into more of these types of videos that I do in the future. Every time I produce a new video, you will get chimed in and notified of it if you do that. So, Norrin Radd, he was born from the minds of Jack Kirby and Stan Lee in the mid-60s, and he's a character who embodies eternal sacrifice. There's an emotional horror to it. There's an existential heartbreak to the character as at the core. He's Marvel's cosmic soul surfer who speaks in philosophical poetry. And he's even more tortured than Batman from DC Comics. He's Marvel's most poetic, tragic hero in my eyes. He is the Silver Surfer.
I am the Silver Surfer, herald of Galactus. Together, we will drain this planet of its energy.
So today, I'd like to explore his journey from noble beginnings of Zen law to his fall as Galactus's herald, and then even like the decades-long odyssey of pain, redemption, and his pop culture obscurity, I should say, because he's not a household name. I guess that's part of why I love him. But damn, is he a cool character on every level. Now, the Silver Surfer, he first appeared in Fantastic Four, number 48, in 1966. And this was what was referred to as the iconic Galactus trilogy. He was not originally in the script that Stan Lee had created for Jack Kirby. Kirby later went on and added him as a surfer, like just this visual metaphor for like a scout or like a servant to this godlike character that Stan Lee had asked him to make. You know, they had all these typical villains in the Fantastic Four, and they wanted to have something that was on the next level, something godlike that they had to deal with. Because Reed Richards was so smart and he was always finding ways to beat these typical villains, they were going to take it to the next level. So that's what Stan Lee had presented to him. Once Jack Kirby had drawn in this servant to him, Stan Lee became enamored with the character's complexity, and then he insisted on giving him a voice and like a moral compass. Jack just drew him and said, you know, if Galactus is a god, this is an actual quotation, if Galactus is a god, he should have a herald. And boom, a silver being of on a surfboard, I guess, emerged. And there was no explanation. And that's what Jack Kirby had kind of envisioned. He was like this blank slate alien, emotionless, noble, but like distant, this silent being who reflected the grandeur of cold logic in the cosmos. Stan Lee comes along, and Stan Lee really was a great writer. I mean, he planned to write, I believe he'd written several novels. He just didn't have them published because he got caught up in his storytelling in comics and magazines. So I don't think it's said enough how great of a writer Stan Lee was. He saw the Surfer and he said, quote, "This guy looks deep." And he gave him voice, and he gave him guilt and sorrow and reflection upon, you know, everything that he was doing. You know, Lee turned the character of Norrin Radd, a peaceful intellectual from a utopian world called Zen law, and had him sacrifice himself to save his people. So, you know, the story goes that, you know, Galactus, this world devourer, shows up at Zen law. He's going to eat the planet like he does with all the planets that he comes across because of his endless hunger. Norrin Radd, who was a scientist on Zen law, a very peaceful planet, comes out as an ambassador to negotiate with him and presents him with the idea that, like, I could be your herald and find more planets for you in a faster amount of time if you will save my planet. Galactus agrees to it. It's like, imagine your job was to introduce entire planets filled with cultures and races and thousands, not if not millions of species for your boss so that you can watch him eat them. There is this mythological allegory to this. I mean, the arc is Promethean. He defies gods in this sense, Galactus, to help humanity, and he's punished for it. And it's also Christ-like in the sense that like it's self-sacrifice, the figure that's misunderstood, and he's got an array of wild powers that he can. One of the biggest is like, and people don't realize this, is he has the power to heal people. He uses it often. You don't hear it being one of those things that like everybody knows that he has the power to heal, but that's one of his most important powers, and he uses it often. And there are not a lot of these type of character relationships that I see all that often, but he is like Jiminy Cricket. He's the voice of reason that is on the side, but he's more like a Jim Morrison, the cricket, stylized in silver, who rides a surfboard, and he's totally cool. And, it's similar, but like there's all of these little aspects that would come from, the archetypes of the hero that Joseph Campbell would have created as a structure of icon. And he falls into so many of them. So after he does there was the trilogy and he showed up in a bunch of Fantastic Four comics, people start writing in and they're like, show us more of the Silver Surfer character. And they were including him more in the Fantastic Four series. But in 1968, they gave him his own solo series, and they put a lot into it because they were these larger, bigger bound books. They would probably be double the price. There was only 18 of them, but they were like oversized, overwrought, and they were brilliantly drawn and they were written by Stan Lee, and most of them were drawn by John Buscema. And there was a little bit of, disparity between Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, because Stan Lee kind of just snatched the character from Jack Kirby and then made it his own and did all the things he wanted to do that Jack Kirby didn't want to do with it. That's why he didn't have him drawing on the first one. It was John Buscema. And me personally, I think John Buscema is a more realistic artist. Not to take anything away from Jack Kirby, it's just I think that Buscema was able to improve on the character. So in the story, because the Silver Surfer has gone against Galactus and helped save Earth and the Fantastic Four, Galactus traps him on Earth as a punishment, and he can't leave Earth. And Galactus goes off, and he's probably going to get another Herald and someone else. So the Surfer becomes like the ultimate outsider in Marvel Comics. He's a messiah figure. He's walking amongst flawed humans, and he doesn't understand them. He's constantly lamenting on like their cruelty, the constantly covering the concept of war and their greed. And they do get the chance to introduce a lot of really great villains. So early on, he fights Mephisto. Mephisto is one of the greatest villains in Marvel Comics, and he wanted to claim his soul. And so he debated mankind's moral failures. And it's almost like this, he's got these monologues that are, right out of Shakespeare, Hamlet or something like that. So he wasn't just, a superhero. He was so much deeper than that. And I think that's part of why I resonated to him, because he was a tragic hero. I mean, there's this cosmic literature to it. And often like there's, melodramatics about it, but, he's undeniably ambitious in wanting to help fix the ill trajectory of mankind, because he's trapped here, and he's just like, why are you guys doing this to each other? And the series didn't last, and I think that's because they kind of shifted gears a little ways into it. I mean, I think it was like by the 7th issue they're introducing like Frankenstein and a bunch of other characters, and they had stopped doing the heavy bound large oversized books. They made them smaller, and they did have a crossover with him and Spider-Man for a moment, but it just kind of died down. And in the end, Jack Kirby did get to draw the final issue, which was issue 18. Readers of Marvel Comics did become enamored with the Silver Surfer. And it's odd because they used him sparingly after that. I mean, he showed up in various stories here and there in the 70s, but it was mostly like Fantastic Four again. He showed up with Thor a few times, but in Thor they used Galactus more often than they used the Silver Surfer. He showed up in a couple of Avengers comics, and then I always forget because I had never collected the Defenders comics, but he was a member of the Defenders, and he was in and out. He wasn't like a mainstay there. Now, the whole time, and bear in mind his main love interest was Shalla-Bal. Shalla-Bal ended up being the Silver Surfer in the Fantastic Four movie that just came out recently. In the comics, she becomes a Silver Surfer at some other point. So it's not like they're changing it too much. They're just using a different herald. But she was important. Her first appearance is in Silver Surfer #1. Initially, in the first 20 years of the Silver Surfer's existence in comics, he was yearning for his lost love, Shalla-Bal, who was, left on Zen-La, and he was in servitude to Galactus and then trapped on Earth. And if you think about it, like Galactus didn't just take his body. I mean, he severed his heart from Shalla-Bal. She was where his thoughts were all the time. So if you read the dialogue that's going on in his head in a lot of those books, they reside in, as she was his North Star emotionally and existentially, always. Later on in the 80s, they did a reboot series. And so Shalla-Bal becomes the Empress of Zen-La, and they are reunited, but there's some awkwardness because she has a new role. She's got a lot of responsibilities as the Empress to Zen-La, and he's got a different role too. So they're both different people by the time, and this is 20, 25 years later that they're reunited, and it's just not the same. And if you think about it, if you had a high school sweetheart and you guys were ripped apart, and then 20 years later you're brought back together, both of you have probably moved on. Less so emotionally for these two, just because that's the way it was written. But when they find each other, it's just not the same. So their love was kind of destroyed slowly over time, and it was transformed into more of a memory. And that was like a symbol that they could never reclaim just because of the way things were at that point. Silver Surfer did end up having several other love interests, some that I thought were more interesting. For the most part, Nova was a big love interest in the series in the 80s, and that's the one that I was the most interested in with him. Nova was Frankie Ray. She was one of the friends of the Fantastic Four, and she sacrifices herself later on and becomes a herald to Galactus. Mantis is another one. You might know her from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. She was for a short time a love interest to the Silver Surfer. Now, he's more or less defined by his morality, and that's typical with certain characters in comics or even in literature itself. He doesn't want power. He doesn't want vengeance. He wants peace. And he's always, he's working it out in his head. Why aren't they doing this? It's so simple. And, we all do this. That's why it's easy to relate to this character, because he's having thoughts that people have all the time. You turn on the news and you're like, what are they doing? Why are they fighting? They're fighting for this reason? That's stupid. That's the dialogue that goes on in Nornrad's head constantly. And he refuses to kill. He laments destruction, even for his enemies. He doesn't want to see his enemies die. He doesn't want to see the destruction of other planets. And this is something over time, when he's watched Galactus just consume planets, it's probably a pain that's built up, and he's got a lot of scars, on his soul. If you were to, they don't touch on religion, of course, but if he was a religious person, he would probably be Buddhist. Because he does have this detachment, but that there's this level of compassion that he has that's for all of life. And he's, because he's an alien from another planet, he doesn't distinguish as humanoids is the most important. He really is in favor of all life. And I find too, because I've read it in later stories, he is the conscience of the Marvel universe. He later on shows up in the Infinity Gauntlet. He gets introduced to Thanos. He literally watches Thanos, because Thanos was introduced or reemerged in the Silver Surfer comics in the 80s. And the Silver Surfer is following him along as he gets each one of these stones. And he's there when he gets the final stone. he's witness to like what could be the end of all of civilization because of his completion of this search for these 6 stones. And you'll remember, like, he wasn't in the Infinity War, the movie with Thanos. And that's just because they didn't have the rights to the Silver Surfer yet. They used Iron Man and the Hulk for some of the key components that would have been the Silver Surfer's role in that story. And in that 80s series, when it started off, I believe it came out in 1987. It was written by Steve Englehart and it was drawn by Marshall Rogers. And here's the thing, like, I think Marshall Rogers is a good artist. Most notably, he had done a lot of like the Batman comics in the DC. I don't think he was a good artist for the Silver Surfer. If you look at some of the characters that he drawn, like even the Silver Surfer, they're just goofier than some of the others. And like, if you look at all the villains, they look like these weird villains that would have been in like a Muppet movie or like, something that would be in a Grimm's fairy tale, like the Frog Princess or like Rumpelstiltskin. Just they're corny and goofy characters. I did not love it, but I love the Silver Surfer so much I was buying the book. And then Ron Lim comes along, and Ron Lim defined the way the Silver Surfer looked. He looked amazing. He was sleek. He was powerful. He was strong. He had these fine, very fine lines. Ron Lim had drawn, a whole bunch of the Captain America comics, and he did a great job on that. But he was just iconic with the Silver Surfer, and that went all the way. I think it was the 90s by the time he had shown up. That's also when Jim Starlin, the great writer, came aboard. Jim Starlin had actually created Thanos, and so when he took over the Silver Surfer book, he wanted to take one of his favorite characters. Unfortunately, he had killed off Thanos, so in the Silver Surfer comics, he had to revive him and then go on this journey to go after the stones. And Jim Starlin's writing on the Silver Surfer book is really what made, these were the great books of the Silver Surfer run from the 80s and 90s. And I'll point out, so like going back to the beginning, in that series, the Silver Surfer finally escapes Earth with some help from Reed Richards. He finally gets to go off and have these great stories. Because, keep in mind, like, we knew about the Silver Surfer coming to Earth when he was introduced in the 60s, and it had all these great adventures before that, but we didn't get to see them. We just know that they existed. Now we get to go and see him go off on all of these adventures in the cosmos. And we get to see cosmic wars and these alien empires that he either negotiates with or has to like kind of, be the ambassador between them or even fight some of them. He battles Galactus. He battles with Galactus. Galactus is this, godlike character that is sometimes more important in some wars and civilizations. So he does back up Galactus in some cases. He's also like has that love interest with Nova. So he's working with Nova and helping her because she's the herald to Galactus. So he's doing whatever she needs. He has showdowns with Mephisto again and, Thanos, of course. And that's always, to me, was the big villain that Silver Surfer ended up being attached to. Now, I'm not as familiar with the modern era. I don't read the series. I believe it started in 2014, and he's introduced to like it was more of like a Doctor Who traveling with this human woman, Dawn Greenwood. And that's a love interest that comes along later. I'm not that familiar with all those, so I don't want to touch on those. But there is this one series. It's a 4-issue limited series called Requiem. And this is one of the most, even like Silver Surfer, don't like Silver Surfer, like this is one of Marvel's great short stories that tells the story. And they did this with Superman too in the DC comics where like, I believe that's All-Star Superman. But with this in Requiem, he's dying and he has like this last hurrah and he goes and he visits with Doctor Strange and Reed. And I think it was the second issue. He has this really great story with Spider-Man where he goes, I think they just happen to kind of, I don't want to say bump into each other because that's kind of weird, but they happen to cross paths and he offers to give Spider-Man the experience of all of the cosmic power that Silver Surfer has. Just experience it, not necessarily like hand it off as here's my power. And Spider-Man being this like, oh no, I don't want to, but you know what? Like my wife, Mary Jane Watson, she would love that as a gift. He's always thinking about like MJ versus himself. So he allows the Silver Surfer to give to MJ this experience. And MJ is absolutely transformed just by touching the Silver Surfer and experiencing everything that he's gone through. And it absolutely transforms MJ, and she can't wait to tell Spider-Man about all of it. And it's this really interesting little tidbit within this 4-issue series that, ends beautifully as well too. I won't give away the ending. It's definitely something you should go out, find these 4 books. They don't cost much, but is one of the greatest stories I've ever read. He also did like the Silver Surfer Black series. That was not one that I followed closely. I don't buy a lot of modern comics, so I'm not an expert from this point on. But this I guess this Black book has like a cosmic jazz to it, and Silver Surfer fights gods and births stars, and he confronts all kinds of darkness, and it's just something new. It wasn't necessary for me, mostly because I didn't really love the art, but it's there for people, and I understand that it's quite popular. But I'll leave you with this as far as like what the Silver Surfer is and what he embodies. And he really is this classic Joseph Campbell archetype and myth. He's reluctant to take on the journey, but he's forced to do this because of his noble duties. He's like Prometheus, and he's punished for bringing salvation. I'd mentioned he's Christ. He's the savior and sacrifices himself, and he's misunderstood. And he's also like Sisyphus, who's, the character that's forever rolling the boulder of guilt up the hill of hope. And, if you've read any of the books, that is kind of a running theme that's going through. And he's back to square one all the time. It's almost like one of the episodes of The Incredible Hulk from the 70s. It's just a sad character that, he's trying to do what's right and what's good for, everybody, and they just don't see it. And there's also the aspect like he's a Hermes slash like I guess Hermes would be the Roman, or the Greek, and Mercury would be the Roman version. So he's this divine messenger, cosmic traveler, and he embodies that archetype of the cosmic wanderer. Always seeking meaning in like it's an uncaring universe that he's kind of found himself in. He questions the gods. He never becomes one of them. And that's his power. He's a tragedy, part Messiah, part wanderer, he's a prophet in a sense. He's in a universe of rage, power, and egos, and he represents the good conscience. Another thing too, like, and I've said this in previous videos about just the essence of him. I've always wondered why this didn't show up more, in that the henchman to the main villain, who turns on the main villain to help people. And I never understood why that character didn't show up more. And that's who he is. He was a henchman to Galactus. And that's the same as Darth Vader. So Darth Vader was this tragic character who was a servant to the Emperor. And at the last minute, he turns on the Emperor to save his son, Luke. Pretty much saves the universe from the Empire. So it's similar in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, when Quasimodo goes against Frollo in multiple scenes. So, even like Nebula did it in Endgame, or I think she did it in Infinity War, I should say. And Snape, if you're a Harry Potter fan, it's not a character that shows up too often, and I wish it did, because it's really rich, and I find it intriguing. He has shown up in pop culture here and there. It's always one of those things where like, who's he talking about? If it's exciting. And he was in, like, there was the Fantastic Four movie, which was The Rise of the Silver Surfer. He was done, I don't want to say poorly. I don't want to say well. It was just, they did him. Lawrence Fishburne did like a serviceable job on him. I think a little too philosophical was the approach there. And I always liked this hopefulness to him was an aspect of the character that I wish was there. And that's what did show up in the new Fantastic Four movie. And I was very happy about that, even though it was Shella Ball, not Norrin Rad. And he was like, he's mentioned in The Big Lebowski. He's mentioned in Reservoir Dogs. I've heard in interviews that Quentin Tarantino talks about him. He's even mentioned in the movie The Crimson Tide with Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. And it must be just because the writer of the script was, had an affection for the Silver Surfer.
Give a damn about what you'd rather forget about. Why were you two fighting?
Well, I said that the Kirby Silver Surfer was the only real Silver Surfer, and that the Mobius Silver Surfer was shit.
Now, everybody that reads comic books knows that Kirby Silver Surfer is the only true Silver Surfer. Now, am I right or wrong?
You're right, sir.
All right.
But yeah, and it's weird that it's included in that, but I got excited when I saw it. So why does all this matter? It's because he's what we wish all of us were. Some of us aren't as good as we think we are, but like this is who we would want to be or who we would romanticize about for ourselves. We all want power, but would we use it wisely? We all want love, but we're afraid to lose it. And we all want redemption, but we fear we don't deserve it. It's subconscious issues that, we all deal with. And this character touches on those things. The Silver Surfer isn't just a superhero. He's a metaphor. He's for sacrifice. He's about alienation. He's about compassion. And these are all things that for most of us, we relate to that. He's the only Marvel character who can surf through a black hole and still feel sad about it, for the most part. But he does his thing and it's so cool. It's space exploration, but it's a day in the life for him. He's Marvel's soul. And he's still out there somewhere looking for meaning in the void. The Silver Surfer is more than just, like some silver-skinned spaceboard dude. He is the Marvel's cosmic heart, a reminder that even the coldest reaches of the universe, the spark of morality can still shine. I want to thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'm Foxy Cellars. If you would, click subscribe. You'll be notified of future videos that I produce. Thanks again.